Ma'am, what exactly do translations look like compared to the original literary artwork? What do some philosophers say about this process of translation? And would love to know about your opinion and some of your observations related to translations.
Well, I'm not a translator, but yes, I would say, I mean, in answer to your first question, first part of the question, if a translation is good, in a way, it is a work of art in its own right. Hmm? So, and maybe the litmus test for a good translation is that it should not be recognizable as a translation. So, and I think to be, I mean, I've done a little bit of translating. To be a good translator, to translate really well, you have to be completely fluent in two languages, in the two languages that you're dealing with. Not only in the fluent in the languages, you have to have an intimate familiarity and empathy for both cultures. And then one should have a deep appreciation, or at least deep knowledge about the author whose work you're translating, and also about the topic. You need to know something about the topic and to really appreciate its importance. Otherwise, your translation is going to be sort of like dead wood. So you have to do it with heart and soul. And then I think what is required for a translation to be good, one has to have a gift for writing, like authors. A translator also has to be like an author. He or she has to know how to write really well, and that it comes over to the reader. And perhaps it's even more difficult, because you're putting across somebody else's picture, ideas. So it has to be even more convincing. And and there, I think you need to have a commitment to precision. You have to describe precisely what the author is saying. It shouldn't be a literal translation, but the idea that he's trying to convey has to be. You have to take that really seriously. I mean, it's in a way, it's a commitment towards precision and authenticity. So I think those are the factors that probably anybody who's writing about translations or who's doing a translation would have to take into consideration. But with regard to the value, I mean, how translation is viewed, I mean, what it takes, what it involves, I think it involves not just translating a text, but understanding about the sociology of the matter. So you have to have also something about cultural studies, philosophy, because the concept of ideas, linguistics, to get the right translation, the right word, and also psychology, because usually one is dealing with something human, people. So and I think translation involves a synergy between all these disciplines. I mean, philosophy, psychology, linguistics, sociology, and it's a science in a way. But then again, it's an art, and it's a skill. So I think that, it needs a lot of talent and commitment and practice to do it well, to be a good translator.
It is said that the study of dialects is done very sincerely abroad. Are there any special universities or institutions for dialects there? And I would like to know that about your observations related to these universities or institutions and studies related to dialects.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I'm not an expert in this field, but I mean, a dialect is a form of a language, of the mother language, and in a way, the dialect shows something about the history of the language, because it shows how the language has developed. And not only the history, but also maybe about the political factors. economic factors, how one dialect becomes more important than another. In a way, there's a saying that a language is a dialect behind which there is an army and a navy. If one dialect, say Irani here, has the support of the state with their military, say during Shivaji's time, and the navy, then it has a political, economic, and social importance. It can rise to the status of a language. So this, I think, it shows how the social, political, and economic embeddedness of language and dialects in society, and show how they develop. So but there are, in your part of your question about where it's studied. I think dialects would be studied in most universities in the Department of Linguistics. It would be a section of the Department of Linguistics. I mean, there's been quite a lot of work done on dialects in European languages, on German dialects, French dialects, English dialects, Italian dialects, and then Spanish dialects. And in Spain, there is also this. There's in most countries there's a high language. Like in Britain, you have Oxford English, or one says Queen's English, whereas you have dialects, which would be sort of Midlands, would be a different kind of. It would be a regional variation of English, which would have different vocabulary. And maybe even the syntax would be different. I mean, maybe some different grammatical rules. But as for instance, in German, I mentioned that German is a federal country, federal government, and Germany was united as a nation in 1871, quite late. Prior to that, you had German principalities, or little small kingdoms within the German-speaking area, and they had their own cultural practices, not just their own political structures, but also traditions of dress, food, folklore were different, and also language. The language of the region was defined by defined by history. I mean, you have to understand, how a language develops according to certain rules of linguistics, but also, what has been borrowed from another. There's been some influence, say, of French, which borders on Germany. France borders on Germany, so there may be some French influence. Then some French words would be adopted into the language, into this specific regional language, which is a dialect. And most of these dialects, they wouldn't have their own script. I mean, they can be written, but it would be the same, Latin script. Not like in India, where you have different scripts. Like Gujarati has a different script. Punjabi would have a different script to Hindi. Yeah. But in Europe, you would have the same script, but it would be written, because of the pronunciation. It would be written in a phonetic way, so it would be different. And there are certain words that you would have in one dialect that you would not have in another dialect, or in the main language. So one can learn about certain cultural traditions that are no longer known by looking at the developments looking at the structure of different dialects, looking at their semantics and the words that are being used, the structure of the sentence, the pronunciation, all that. You can perhaps from that you could deduce certain developments, certain political, economic, cultural developments would be there. Yes, like language. I mean, there's an emphasis or there was an emphasis in Europe, especially which was, I think, sort of influenced by the centralization of politics, of state politics. Britain is a centralized state, same with France. And so there one would have an emphasis on the proper language, the main language. And that is then defined as Queen's English, or the English that is spoken by the aristocracy, but also the higher level, or academic, Oxbridge English one also talks about, or now BBC English. Um, and so people who didn't speak that language felt as though they were somehow inferior if they spoke dialect. And so they would make a special effort to learn this high language so that their status, their social status was considered on par with others, and especially at university and that. But then from the 60s, with all this sort of hippie movement and the music movement, the Beatles come from Liverpool, Liverpudlian, that's a dialect. And they spoke in their Liverpudlian accent and used local words, and they became so famous. So there was an emphasis, I think, a desire among the youth, and a tendency for the youth or for people to say, "Oh, we're proud of our local language. We shouldn't hide it. We shouldn't think that we have to speak Queen's English, BBC English. We can speak our language, and it's considered. Look at the Beatles, or other groups." And then there's a dialect that is spoken in East London. It's called Cockney. Cockney is a sort of slang. Maybe there's a difference between dialect and slang. It's rather a crude form of language. But East London is the working class London. It's also where there were it was very high, had a very high level of crime, and it was considered as unhealthy, in the 19th century. I mean, when Dickens writes, he writes about some parts of East London, a poor area, and people there, they have this very sort of it's a physical language. It's but also rather crude and vulgar, not refined, but it's also very expressive, and you have that in France as well, in Germany too. The versions of that. So these and this was then considered to be not proper. For if you're in high society, you shouldn't speak this. But then it became quite okay, politically correct to speak Cockney. And although, I mean, there are varieties of Cockney. I mean, people who are educated, they may have a slight sort of accent, different intonation, but they wouldn't speak Cockney as people living in these. It was a sort of slum area, more or less. Now it's changed, but that was sort of from the late 19th century up to the Second World War. Then afterwards things change.
So, ma'am, thank you very much for your time and everything. Every word which you spoke was really precious. I mean, I was so flattered by every incident that you were talking, and there were so many things which actually, made me learn something. So, thank you very much for everything.
Well, thank you, and thanks to your father too for having this idea. I'm not used to being interviewed, so I haven't done it very professionally, but I felt that the questions that you asked were very, very important questions. And of course, one could say a lot about every single question. I could have spoken for an hour or so, but we wanted to get it recorded within a certain time period. And but I feel that maybe you've given me the incentive to think more about these topics, and I think yes. Well, I hope people find it interesting. We need to maybe consider some of these topics in more detail, and as I said, I will reflect more on them, and maybe I've given made some suggestions that can be followed up by others in these different topics. But it was your questions that were able to start this conversation going that I think will take various forms. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.